If it's Thursday, on the road again, Vice President Harris and former President Trump hold their first campaign rallies since Tuesday's debate as the fallout from the wild night intensifies with just 54 days until the election. Plus, Attorney General Merrick Garland offers his most forceful defense of the Justice Department yet, slamming what he calls a, quote, unprecedented spike in threats against DOJ officials amid repeated attacks from former President Trump and his allies. And we're following breaking news in New York City, where the NYPD commissioner has just resigned amid multiple federal investigations swirling around the mayor and his inner circle and the police force. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. With just 54 days until the election, Vice President Harris and former President Trump are both hitting crucial battleground states today as the dust settles from Tuesday night's debate. The Harris campaign previewing a more aggressive strategy in the wake of their rival's rocky debate performance and the escalating fallout now facing his campaign. The vice president is speaking right now at the first of two events today in North Carolina, a state Democrats hope they can flip in November to expand their potential path to victory. Harris opened her remarks moments ago, calling for another debate after the former president posted on social media last hour that there won't be another debate.
2 nights ago, Donald Trump and I had our first debate. And I believe we owe it to the voters to have another debate. Because this election and what is at stake could not be more important.
Now, this all comes as polls continue to show an extremely tight race. VP Harris will continue her battleground blitz tomorrow with 2 stops in Pennsylvania as the former president focuses his attention out west, speaking in Arizona today and Nevada tomorrow. And it all comes as the Trump campaign is facing new fallout from his comments Tuesday night, including his baseless claims that Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, are eating cats and dogs. Trump's debate performance also cited in a stunning op-ed by former Bush Attorney General Alberto Gonzales endorsing Harris. On social media, the former president has doubled down on claims of a debate night victory, and his running mate, J.D. Vance, is now defending his performance.
You didn't have any frustration with what he was focusing on versus what he could have said about the vice president?
Look, I think his closing statement was a critical piece of the debate because he drove home the entire message up to that point, which is Kamala Harris says she wants to do all these great things. Kamala Harris is currently the vice president of the United States. Why isn't she doing it now?
Well, the former president's strongest debate moment did come at the end of the night, according to his allies. Republican strategist Karl Rove argues it was overshadowed by missed opportunities and a litany of falsehoods. Rove writing in the Wall Street Journal, quote, Mr. Trump came across as hot, angry, and fixated on the past, especially his own. He was crushed by a woman he previously dismissed as dumb as a rock, which raises the question, what does that make him? Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. Yamiche Alcindor has the very latest from Springfield, Ohio, on community reaction to Trump's comments. And Vaughn Hillyard is in Tucson, Arizona, where the former president is set to speak next hour. Monica, let me start with you, the vice president in North Carolina. A state Democrats have not won since 2008 in the presidential race. Give us a reality check. Is that state in play?
Well, the Harris team certainly thinks so now, Kristen, though, of course, they continue to say they think these polls are an accurate reflection of where things are in the race, which is that things are incredibly tight. But they do believe North Carolina is in play, and they think that certain issues like health care, for instance, will really resonate with voters. And that's why you saw the vice president just now in these remarks attacking former President Trump's own comments from the debate earlier this week, where when he was asked about the Affordable Care Act or other potential health care plans, he responded with that line that really now has since become a key moment, which is, I have concepts of a plan, but he didn't go beyond that. So she sort of ridiculed him for that and is talking about, of course, where she stands on that issue. And they really believe that when it comes to some of these other key issues that may drive voter decisions, like reproductive freedom or the economy, that certainly the vice president and her team are going to try to make those kinds of arguments in North Carolina. But that's definitely a place they're looking to be a potential really key and critical pickup if they're successful there, though they acknowledge that they believe her path really goes through some of the other key states in the Rust Belt, for instance. But they, of course, are going to spend a lot of time in this state as well, Kristen.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, Monica. Let's talk strategy. I know you've been doing a lot of reporting about this. How is the campaign now looking to capitalize on her debate performance? What can we expect looking forward, Mon?
Well, they're really trying to put this in terms of the momentum, and they're trying to seize on momentum that they similarly saw after the Democratic National Convention or after Tim Walz was named as her running mate. They're trying to use the fact that there has been some really successful fundraising in these moments, and they're turning that directly into new ads that they're really pulling from Tuesday night's debate. And really, they're trying to say that the entirety of the 1 hour and 40-minute exchange should basically be an ad for them, which shows you how confident and optimistic they are about how they believe she did on the debate stage. And they really want to put this now into the conversation. And you saw there the vice president indicating that she feels the American people are owed another debate. Former President Trump, for his part, seems to indicate today online that there won't be any other kind of a matchup between the two. So the vice president and her campaign are really going to now take on, they say, this more aggressive stance of a little bit more travel. She's going to be on the road, as you mentioned. So will Governor Walz. So will their spouses. And then you're going to really just see that money put to use in some of these battleground states, we understand, and likely more ads. So they're really trying to say that you're going to be seeing a lot more of the vice president, though one question remains on whether she's going to be doing more media interviews. The campaign thinks she's going to do some more local sit-downs, but there's still, of course, a lot of questions about some specifics and some policies and proposals she hasn't gone into with a lot of granularity. Kristen.
Well, Monica, I don't mind saying that we have put the request in for an interview with her, so hopefully that will come to fruition. Yamiche, let me turn to you now. I mean, you've been covering the fallout of these baseless claims that we heard from former President Trump about Haitian migrants in Springfield. Of course, Trump raised them at the debate. And then today, there's news of a bomb threat. Is it related to these rumors? What can you tell us about all of that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure that the bomb threat is related to these rumors that are, of course, connected to these baseless claims. But what I can tell you is that it really is adding to the tension here in Springfield, Ohio. This is, of course, a place where an influx of Haitian migrants have come, about 15,000 of them in over the past few years, according to state officials. And they came because local officials were advertising coming to Springfield because of new manufacturing jobs and also because of, they said, city affordability. So they were welcoming Haitian immigrants, hoping that they would come here, and people were excited to have them. They were taking jobs and getting jobs and filling jobs that other people didn't want to take. And now, of course, there's this circulating rumor going on, and people are really heartbroken by this. Of course, chief among them, the Haitian immigrants who told me they were fleeing insecurity in Haiti, gang violence, and all sorts of terrible things. And now they're in Springfield feeling unsafe again. So it's a really heartbreaking thing because they're worried that they're going to get targeted. I talked to somebody who even said that they're keeping their children at home and that they don't want to walk the streets alone anymore because they're worried about what could happen, Kristen.
And the claims have been picked up by the right. They've been repeated, again, as we've been saying, by the presidential candidate and, of course, his running mate. You've been delving into the origins of this rumor. What have you uncovered about that?
Well, from what we can tell, our team here at NBC News have all been digging into this. The pet rumors are connected with an unrelated case in a different part of Ohio that dealt with a U.S. citizen who was arrested for a gruesome incident with a cat. That person, though, was not of Haitian origin, from what we understand. Again, they were a U.S. citizen. But that rumor of immigrants and cats got conflated, and it got really made its way into the right-wing conspiracy theory ether, and then made its way to Trump aides. And then, of course, we saw Senator J.D. Vance posting on X about it, posting on, of course, that site that used to be called Twitter. And then, of course, we saw former President Trump bring it up on the debate stage again. City officials, state officials say there is no evidence of these claims, but they are now being circulated widely and have gone viral, really, in a lot of places.
And you, of course, have been speaking to Haitian immigrants as well as some Springfield residents. Yamiche, what are they telling you?
I have been speaking to some Springfield residents, including one man who manages a Facebook group that's focused on saying that they don't want more Haitian immigrants here. He told me that he thinks some of these baseless claims are credible, even though there's no evidence. Take a listen to more of what he told me.
Oh, it's been disastrous for especially the working class and working poor people in the community. It's just entirely too many people all at once.
What's your response to Haitian immigrants who say they're coming here to revitalize Springfield?
That's not what's happening for Springfield. I mean, it might happen for them. It might happen for the landlords that are enriching themselves, the city manager who's trying to pad his budget with more federal deficit spending.
He also said that he's scared that Springfield has been lost. And when I asked him what that meant, he said, well, it's going to go from being an American community to a Haitian community. Now, people are pushing back on that, saying, well, that's the story of America. America is a story where immigrants, whether you're Italian or German or Polish, that you come here and make communities here. So that's been a long part of the American history here. But he is very much saying that he doesn't want to see that in Springfield. And I also talked to a man who was too scared to go on camera, but he told me that he's heartbroken because he came here from Haiti just a few months ago, got a construction job legally, and now his coworkers have been repeatedly asking him if he eats cats and dogs, and he told me that he's now depressed about this. He's very, very sad about this, very, very traumatized, on top of the trauma of course, having to leave his country against his own will, because he didn't want to leave Haiti, but the gang violence made him have to do that. So definitely a heartbreaking situation, Kristen.
Yamiche, thank you for all of your tremendous reporting from Springfield. Vaughn, Hillyard, let me turn to you now. You just heard Yamiche's reporting there. How did this go from a viral claim to something that we heard from Donald Trump on the debate stage?
Right, Kristen, this comes down to really how Donald Trump's campaign has been run in 2024. In 2016 and his time in the White House, as you're so familiar with, he was at least a little bit insulated. And there were campaign managers or administration officials that kind of served as gatekeepers as to who was able to get Donald Trump's ear and was able to block a great many conspiracy theories, falsehoods from making it ever directly to the candidate or the then president. But what's different about this time around is really anybody, it's been described to me, that wants to talk to Donald Trump. If Donald Trump wants to talk to them, they have not been kept away from him. And that is where you see the likes of Laura Loomer, who is this right-wing provocateur online. She is somebody who has been at the forefront of promoting this conspiracy theory of pets being eaten in Ohio. But it's not exactly clear where Donald Trump got this from. He said that himself he saw it on TV, but it's not clear where on TV. We know that J.D. Vance, his running mate, was openly talking about it. His own son, Don Jr., was posting about the conspiracy theory ahead of the debate. We also know that right-wing provocateurs like Charlie Kirk and Jack Posobiec, who Donald Trump follows and is in touch with, that they were promoting this in the days ahead of the debate. And so ultimately, this is who Donald Trump has largely surrounded himself by here over the last 2 years. They won him the Republican nomination, but now just mere weeks before early ballots go out, there are some allies who have openly questioned whether that sort of focus and discussion around these sorts of topics on the debate stage is what it's going to take to win a general election that, frankly, they want to see Republican get into the White House.
Yeah, and Vaughn, I know you've been talking to the president, the former president's allies, as have I. You heard J.D. Vance there defending the performance. Privately, though, allies say they are very concerned about what happened on that debate stage, that they want there to be another debate. What are you hearing about that?
Well, I think this is where the unique part of this is Donald Trump is really the campaign manager of his own campaign. Yesterday morning, one of his senior advisors said that Donald Trump would debate again. At the same time, Donald Trump was actively on Fox saying that he would not debate. Come a few hours later, yesterday afternoon, he said he would do a debate on our own network, NBC, and do one on Fox. But he said he hadn't quite made up his mind to fast forward 24 hours. Just in the last few minutes, you and Monica were discussing, he is now saying that there is going to be no third debate. And spokespeople for his campaign say that you heard the man, was their response when they were asked to confirm of whether this would mean that Donald Trump would not be appearing alongside Kamala Harris before November 5th. And so for Donald Trump, he is claiming that he won this debate. And clearly, though, it's two different approaches from what we saw after the June debate with Joe Biden and what we saw with Kamala Harris when he chose to come out to the spin room and add on to his messaging here. And so I think at this point in this juncture for him, he has seen the poll numbers tighten. And clearly, he has decided that he is best on the campaign stage on platforms that he feels more comfortable with, and choosing, at least for now, not to go head-to-head with Kamala Harris again.
Well, fascinating turn of events. Vaughn Hillyard, thank you so much for your reporting. As always, we appreciate it. Well, the election is, as we have said now, 54 days away. But the first general election ballots are now on their way to voters. Alabama is the first state to start sending out absentee ballots, and eligible residents who requested them can begin returning them as soon as they arrive. Tens of millions of people are expected to vote by mail in this election, and state election officials are now warning that the post office isn't ready. Two organizations that represent state election directors and secretaries of state are expressing their concerns in an open letter to Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, highlighting what they say are shortcomings in the mail system, including improper training of postal workers and long delivery times. They write, quote, "We implore you to take immediate and tangible corrective action to address the ongoing performance issues with U.S. postal election mail service. Failure to do so will risk limiting voter participation and trust in the election process." Joining me now to discuss this is NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, thank you so much for being here to discuss this really important topic. Can you break this down for us? What are the specific concerns exactly?
Well, this was a pretty explosive letter yesterday. This comes from the National Association of Secretaries of States as well as state elector officers who are worried that there could be delays that would keep people's ballots from getting where they need to go to be counted by Election Day. They cite not enough training for USPS employees on how to handle what could be a massive number of mail-in ballots. They also are worried about delays, and they say that there's an increasing number of mail that gets sent back to the sender because there may be something wrong with it and that it's just taking too long. But there was a pretty sharp rebuke we saw from USPS today saying that they think they saw success in the past two elections, 2020 and 2022, and that they have this handled. They didn't commit to making any changes, Kristen.
Well, that's fascinating, and the timing of this is fascinating as well. Why send this letter 8 weeks or less before Election Day?
You know, I think they've been getting a lot of questions about what can be done to help secure the vote. I was just in Georgia last week speaking to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger there. He wants to show everyone how they go to the polling place, they cast their ballot, it gets counted at the precinct. But they have a lot less control over mail-in ballots. It's much harder to control. But as we know, we saw such a ramping up of mail-in ballots in 2020, and they expect that to continue this year. And so I think it's an area where they're more concerned, and so they've been getting more questions about it. This is the most firm thing they've said. But yeah, it kind of seems like, why didn't you bring this up earlier?
Yeah. Given that, Julia, what happens next? Can these issues, these concerns actually be fixed before Election Day?
Well, it seems that USPS didn't necessarily make any commitments to changing that. There could be ways where they might look at certain areas where there are more mail-in ballots. In fact, there's some states, including Oregon, that's mail-in only. And so those could be states where that is examined more carefully. But they're saying they were successful in 2020, successful in 2022, and there's no reason to think they won't be able to handle a massive number of mail-in ballots this election.
All right. Well, I know you will stay on top of this story for us. Julia, thank you. Great to see you,
Kristen.
as always. Coming up, a major move from the Department of Homeland Security declaring the certification of the Electoral College vote as a national special security event. Nearly 4 years after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. We'll explain exactly what that means. That's next. Plus, embattled Mayor Eric Adams addresses New Yorkers as the city's police commissioner resigns amid a sprawling federal investigation that has embroiled the highest levels of the city's government. Do not go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The January 6th attack on the Capitol happened nearly 4 years ago. And today, the Department of Homeland Security announced that it is designating the counting and certification of the Electoral College vote on January 6, 2025, as a national special security event. It's a designation reserved for events of the highest national significance. It comes as Attorney General Merrick Garland is speaking out in emotional remarks about threats facing the Justice Department ahead of the election, condemning what he calls dangerous political attacks on DOJ officials.
Attacks have come in the form of conspiracy theories, dangerous falsehoods, efforts to bully and intimidate career public servants by repeatedly and publicly singling them out, and threats of actual violence. The work you do every day makes a difference. And the way you do that work makes clear that the public servants of the Department of Justice do not bend to politics, and that they will not break under pressure.
Garland never mentioned Donald Trump by name, but the former president and his allies have repeatedly accused the Biden administration of weaponizing the DOJ as part of a vast government conspiracy to keep him out of office. Baseless claims. Of course, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian joins me now. Just really remarkable to hear the Attorney General that emotional, that forceful. What led to him making those remarks today, Ken?
He's been deeply concerned for some time about there's two levels here. There's the actual physical threats that are manifest against the people that work for him and him, although he never doesn't talk about it. And then there's this question of keeping the Justice Department politically independent, a tradition that he said goes back to Watergate when he first joined the department. And at a time when Donald Trump is promising that if he's elected, he will use the Justice Department to prosecute his enemies. That's not supposed to happen. And what Merrick Garland said today to a group of U.S. attorneys from across the country is we cannot let that happen. We must remain independent. So he was passionate, he was forceful. There's some people I talked to who wish he had done this a lot earlier, who wish he would do it more often. But today he was very forceful.
You know, I'm curious, Ken, has he taken any steps to protect DOJ officials beyond making these remarks?
Well, in terms of threats, there's obviously physical security whenever prosecutors are threatened. So that's happening. In terms of preserving their independence, he took a number of steps when the Biden administration took office to sort of reestablish some norms that had maybe slipped a little bit during the Trump administration. There's really not a lot he can do, though, to protect career officials. If Donald Trump takes office and implements his plans to convert civil servants into political employees, that's going to be a moment of truth for the Department of Justice. And it's anybody's guess how that plays out.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the other aspect that we've been reporting today, DHS designating January 6, 2025 as a national special security event. What exactly does that mean, and how does it prevent the type of violence that we saw on January 6, 2020?
It's the highest level of security designation the government has. So it's given to things like presidential inaugurations, the Super Bowl, the conventions, and it conjures up a whole planning process led by the Secret Service, more resources, and really importantly, they did not make this designation January 6th, 2021, and a lot of people wish they did, because if they had, there would have been more security in place, and maybe that attack would have been repelled. And there was a real lack of coordination, as we all saw, between the Capitol Police and other forces. That should not happen this time around. There will be many, many more resources in place because of this designation.
All right, Ken Dilanian covering a range of angles for us today. Really appreciate it.
You bet.
Great to see you. We want to turn now to a major shakeup in the leadership of the NYPD Police Commissioner. Edward Caban has resigned as multiple federal investigations embroil New York's police department and City Hall. His resignation comes a week after federal investigators seized Caban's phone as they look into whether his brother, who owns a nightclub security business, profited from his ties to the NYPD. Mayor Eric Adams said he accepted Caban's resignation and thanked him for his dedication to making New York safer. Adams did not address the multiple investigations tied to his office and his campaign. Joining me now is NBC News law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter. Tom, thanks so much for joining us on this still developing story. So let's break it down. What do we know about this federal investigation tied to the now former police commissioner of New York?
Well, that's right, Kristen. It was just a bit over a week ago when former Police Commissioner Edward Caban had his phone taken by federal investigators, and not the FBI, but special investigators assigned to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And what we're told is that prosecutors and those investigators are looking into whether or not Caban's twin brother James and perhaps other individuals in New York City government were receiving money from bars and nightclubs in the city in exchange for preferential treatment from police. And so that seems to be, at least initially, the focus of this investigation. Now, Caban hasn't been charged with any crime. His attorneys say that they've been told he's not a target of the investigation, and they say he plans to cooperate. But Caban, in the letter that he sent to the force and what he's been telling people inside the police department, Kristen, is, look, this had just gotten to be too much of a distraction. He did not attend the 9/11 memorial ceremony that happened yesterday. Every time a New York City police commander spoke about the department, they were asked about this investigation. And considering that some of his top deputies within the commissioner's office also had their phones taken, it had really become a big problem for the top of police headquarters. And that's what really ultimately led to today's resignation. But of course, all this comes as there are multiple investigations swirling involving either Mayor Eric Adams' campaign or those who were appointed by him. And some of those investigations are very much ongoing. Additional phones taken, the FBI conducting court-authorized searches. So really the amount of investigations here are starting to ratchet up as we head into the fall and as these investigations have been swirling now in some cases for over a year, Kristen.
Just an extraordinary set of developments, Tom. Just to be very clear, at this point in time, are we aware of any connection between the police commissioner stepping down and these investigations surrounding Eric Adams?
At this point, they all appear to be separate investigations. But one of the things that law enforcement experts have told us and officials who've done these type of investigations before, you got to think, Kristen, the amount of information they should have or would have been able to get in order to ask for the police commissioner's phone from a judge or from a grand jury, and then to conduct these investigations and do them in what has now become a very public way. You never know what might come out of the trees that are being very much shaken by federal investigators. So whether or not there becomes a nexus to the mayor himself or to these other investigations, time will tell. There's a lot of connections between the players here. But again, no charge has been filed. And as you well know, look at the Rudy Giuliani investigation. Just because there's an investigation doesn't mean ultimately that there will be an indictment.
Yeah, really fascinating points, Tom. Thank you for your fantastic reporting as always. We appreciate it. Great to see you.
Sure thing.
And up next, Secretary of State Antony Blinken doubles down on U.S. support for Ukraine in a rare trip to Kyiv after former President Trump refuses to say he wants Ukraine to win during Tuesday's debate. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. After Ukraine launched its surprise incursion into Russia more than a month ago, Moscow is now launching a major counterattack in the Kursk border region. Ukraine claims it has control over some 500 square miles of Russian territory. But today, Russia's Ministry of Defense said it has recaptured 10 settlements. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Ukrainian forces are being, quote, steadily squeezed out of the region. This new push by Russia comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his British counterpart made a rare joint visit to Kyiv yesterday, where Ukrainian officials continue to press the West to allow it to use long-range missiles to strike deeper inside Russia. While speaking to reporters, Blinken said he would take discussion back to Washington, where he would brief the president. He also reiterated America's support and commitment to Ukraine in this war.
The bottom line is this: we want Ukraine to win, and we're fully committed to keep marshaling the support that it needs for its brave defenders and citizens to do just that. Now, support for Ukraine will endure because it doesn't depend on any one country, any one party, any one election.
Joining me now on set is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Thank you so much for being here, Evelyn. Kristen. Great to see you.
Likewise.
Let's talk about what happened on the debate stage Tuesday night in the context of Ukraine. Former President Donald Trump was asked if he wanted Ukraine to win the war. I want to play that exchange, get your reaction on the other side.
I want to ask you a very simple question tonight. Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop. I want to save lives that are being uselessly, people being killed by the millions. It's the millions. It's so much worse than the numbers that you're getting, which are fake numbers. I will get it settled before I even become president. If I win, when I'm president-elect, and what I'll do is I'll speak to one, I'll speak to the other, I'll get them together, that war would have never happened.
Just to clarify in the question, do you believe it's in the U.S. best interest for Ukraine to win this war, yes or no?
I think it's the U.S. best interest to get this war finished and just get it done.
Evelyn, what was your reaction to that? What message does that send?
I mean, it was sort of like, here we go again, to paraphrase other debates. You know, President Trump, once again, is refusing to stand by the international community, U.S. national security interests, and Ukraine's sovereignty. If at the end of the day, if Ukraine doesn't win, and if he can't answer that question to say, yes, I support Ukraine, if Ukraine doesn't win, we are in danger that Russia will be so emboldened that they might try to basically probe NATO, and we could end up at war with Russia. I mean, it's that serious. So you saw the vice president, you know, kind of, I think she was aghast.
What are Ukrainian officials saying? I mean, how closely are they paying attention to this race, to the words of former President Donald Trump, and how are they preparing for a potential Trump administration?
I think part of, you mentioned at the outset the Kursk offensive.
Yes.
I think this is part of how they're preparing. The Ukrainians are setting the battlefield, not just tactically and operationally. Yes, they seized this territory. It remains to be seen whether they actually intend to hold it. They've never said, we're going to hold it, come hell or high water. They've taken it. They've already used it because they seized some prisoners, some Russian conscripts, and exchanged them. So they've already used it to advantage. But the bigger strategic advantage is to show that Russia doesn't control what's happening, that they still have initiative. And they boosted morale in the West and also, of course, in Ukraine.
Let's talk about exactly what's happening on the battlefield. And we should note that actually President Zelensky told our own Richard Engel that he does intend to hold on to the territory. But of course, now Russia has launched this counterattack, which we're discussing. From a practical standpoint, how long can Ukraine maintain control over it?
Yeah, and I think I say that we're not sure whether they will or they can, because our officials, what I'm hearing from our officials behind the scenes is that they don't know whether Ukraine really wants to or really can hold on to it. They still think it achieved lots of strategic objectives, like I said, in the morale, et cetera. How long can they hold on? I don't know. I mean, the fact that they're talking about giving Ukraine, the permission to use the munitions, the long-range munitions, to strike deeper into Russia, I think that's good. I'm not sure whether it's going to turn the tide right now. Russia has such an advantage in terms of manpower and munitions, but anything we can do to help Ukraine essentially take the initiative and buy some time, I think would be helpful. They have to get to the elections at least.
Do you think that the U.S. is going to grant that permission? It sounds like you're optimistic
I do think
they will.
so. I mean, that's reading the tea leaves. That's what we're hearing. And mostly it's because, Kristen, the Iranians, we've now come out publicly. Our government has said, we have the evidence together with the British government, that the Iranians provided ballistic missiles to Russia. We see that as escalatory. So our answer to that is, okay, fine, then the gloves are off and you can use our long-range munitions. The only thing is I don't want the American people to think, oh, now Ukraine has permission and they're going to suddenly take out all these Russian bases and Russian aircraft that are, essentially launching the glide drones and taking and killing Ukrainians. It might not actually work as well because we've been transmitting all this to the Russians for so long, they've moved their forces back. I still think it can have a detrimental effect, and there might be certain things that the Ukrainians can take out, like the Kursk bridge, that could be strategic psychologically and militarily.
I think many Americans look at this conflict and they wonder, how long should Americans expect this conflict to last, and should Americans expect to be contributing to, giving aid to Ukraine?
I think that Americans shouldn't expect it to be over anytime soon. Partly it's because, of course, the Russian government has no interest in a negotiated settlement. And I mentioned earlier, and you were talking about the end game, how will this end, and Kursk. The Ukrainian government is now setting themselves up so that they have a better position if they have to go to the negotiating table. And ultimately, I think the Ukrainian government wants to go, but they're not going to go until Russia's ready, and Russia thinks that time is on its side.
I want to ask you about a slightly different topic, which is, of course, DOJ announced in recent weeks that it was taking action against some Russian officials amid revelations that Russia is, according to DOJ officials, meddling in trying to influence this U.S. election. Do you think enough has been done? How vulnerable is the U.S. right now?
Well, clearly the U.S. is vulnerable, and when things are announced and indictments are, released, and the press knows about it, there's usually more that we don't know about yet. I am taking heart in the fact that they are now the U.S. government is now calling out these Russian agents, saying that they are interfering in our elections, that they are trying to influence Americans to be opposed to support to Ukraine. That's another new dimension of this. And I say that because when I ran for Congress unsuccessfully in 2020, my election was actually attacked by a Russian agent. Unsuccessfully, that's not why I lost. But when it happened, it got very little attention. And it was treated as like a foreign thing that State Department should worry about. It's actually a domestic threat. So I'm glad to see it being handled much more aggressively by our government.
All right, Evelyn Farkas, thank you so much for coming in and bringing us your really important perspective. Thanks. Really appreciate it. After the break, seeing red, Vice President Harris racks up another high-profile Republican endorsement in the race against former President Trump. Why it matters and what it says about the state of the GOP. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Another day, another Bush-era Republican coming out in support of Kamala Harris. As we reported earlier, former Bush Attorney General and longtime Democratic antagonist Alberto Gonzales backed the vice president over Donald Trump, writing in a Politico op-ed, quote, "I can't sit quietly as Donald Trump, perhaps the most serious threat to the rule of law in a generation, eyes a return to the White House. For that reason, though I'm a Republican, I've decided to support Kamala Harris for president." Joining me now on set to discuss this is Betsy Woodruff Swan, national correspondent for Politico, Navin Nayak, president and executive director at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Ramesh Ponnuru, editor at National Review and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to delve into the endorsement by Alberto Gonzales. But first, let's just talk about this breaking news. Donald Trump, Betsy, saying no second debate with Kamala Harris. Your take, and what are the implications, do you think?
It seems to be a bit of a retrenchment on his part and a sign that he didn't think that first debate the other night went particularly well for him. If he'd come out of that event loaded for bear, feeling good, getting good feedback from his team, I think he wouldn't have had any qualms whatsoever. But instead, the fact that he's all of a sudden risk averse shows that he sees these debates as potentially causing more harm than good for him.
Ramesh, one of the fascinating aspects of him saying no second debate with Kamala Harris, he was asking to debate President Biden every week. Right. This looks a little bit, it's a retrenchment. It looks like, a real flip-flop.
Well, it looks sad and weak, to use two of Trump's favorite words. I think it may reflect an accurate sense on his part that what we saw the other night is about the best he can do in terms of his capacities, in terms of his self-control. But at the same time, the one thing I would add is I wouldn't necessarily take this as the last one.
Okay, that was my next question. You think it's possible there is another debate?
I do. I wouldn't, these things, well, for one thing, we can never take Trump's last word ever to be the last word.
Navin, what's your take?
Yeah, listen, a few weeks ago, he wanted 3 debates, right? He was the one who was actually pushing Kamala Harris, and the sense was inversed, where she was the one who people thought were going to be, gun-shy and not interested in having these conversations. They came out moments after the debate ended, asking for another one. And so I think there's no question. If he thought this was to his advantage, he would do it. The thing that does surprise me here is he does have a lot of pride. And I think the conversation is mocking him and sort of criticizing him. I'm surprised it isn't provoking him the way he was provoked all night long to want to have another shot.
Betsy, one of the questions for the Harris campaign is what comes next for her, because while she is perceived to have done quite well on the debate stage, she did leave a lot of questions unanswered. And a majority of Americans are saying, we want to know more information about her. In terms of a strategy shift, if there is no second debate, do you anticipate she's going to be more out front and center in terms of answering some of these tough questions?
Yeah, I think her team has signaled she's going to be doing more local news interviews in swing states. Often that type of format can be unpredictable for candidates. They sometimes go into interviews with local reporters who don't have national profiles, expect it to be softball, expect it to be easy, and then get hit by these curveballs that could be surprising and unpredictable. Local news is awesome, and anytime an important person talks to somebody in local news, that's great to see. The fact that her team is signaling that, though, those may be the forums in which she delves in, particularly on this fracking issue. It's just existential for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's must win, and her position changed rapidly and dramatically. So voters there are going to have way more questions, and I would expect local news to really emphasize that if she does interviews in that state.
It's a really great point, Navin. What do you make of that strategy? And as Betsy says, these local news interviews are really important and can also include some curveballs.
Yeah, but I also think they're reaching the people that she needs to reach. And this is one of the challenges for campaigns in the world we live in, is the media environment is so fractured. The debate had 60+ million watching it. We may not have a moment like that. And so I think it's smart to go and have these conversations in more informal settings. And I think she has shown that she's very comfortable doing them. Yeah. Historically, she did a lot of interviews when she was the vice president. And now that I think we've passed the debate, I think it's a smart strategy.
Ramesh, let's talk about this latest endorsement, Alberto Gonzales. Of course, significant because it's coming on the heels of Dick and Liz Cheney, and it's yet another Republican saying that, you know, he is concerned about the democracy. What, if any, impact do you think this endorsement will have?
I don't know if it itself causes many Republican voters to change their mind or to defect from the Republicans and go to the Democrats. I think it is part and parcel of a shift in both parties, where you're seeing some voting blocks switch places. We've been seeing that for a while. It accelerated under Trump, and Gonzales, I think, is just another part of that. Cheney, I think, has a bigger impact than Gonzales does, just in terms of how widely recognized she is.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the thing it does signal is that this isn't a normal election. And because in no other universe are Dick Cheney and Kamala Harris or Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris on the sort of same side. And I think it does signal that. There's something different about this election. And I don't think it's Alberto Gonzales for voters, but I think it keeps showing that there is something about Donald Trump that is a much bigger risk that voters should take seriously.
But there's also a Robert F. Kennedy for Trump, right? I mean, it does scramble things.
It's also really interesting at a statewide level, too, where the same dynamics that we're seeing nationally with the Cheneys and Alberto Gonzales getting on board with Kamala Harris, in Arizona, we're also seeing the Republican Party basically engage in a strategy of subtraction rather than addition, where many, if not all, of the Bush-era leaders of that party have exited, gone about as far away as they can. But part of the reason that just about every top statewide elected official in Arizona is a Democrat is because the Arizona Republican Party has not succeeded in replacing those departures with the voters that they need to win. So if we see that nationally play out in the way it's already played out in Arizona in a microcosm, then it bodes really poorly for President Trump.
That's a really fascinating point. I want to ask you all about another story that's making some headlines today. The fact that Donald Trump brought Laura Loomer with him to the 9/11 events in New York. For those who don't know, she is someone who has questioned 9/11, said it was an inside job. Ramesh, what do you make of the optics of that? And could it complicate and further alienate some of the voters he needs to win?
Well, I think it's more than an optics problem, although I think it is an optics problem. And you're hearing a lot from people in the campaign who are complaining about Loomer's influence on Trump. But Loomer isn't the problem. The problem is the candidate's judgment. The candidate doesn't mind having kooks around him, especially if they tell him what he wants to hear.
Well, this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene had to say. I'm going to play a little bit of what she had to say and get everyone's reaction on the other side.
I have concerns about her rhetoric and her hateful tone. To me, many of the comments that she makes and how she attacks Republicans like me, many other Republicans that are strong supporters of President Trump, I think they're a huge problem. And that doesn't represent MAGA as a whole. It doesn't represent who we are as Republicans. You know my personality. Everyone knows I'm outspoken, and I just felt like it was time to call it out.
Betsy, fascinating to hear that from Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's no stranger to, stirring up her own controversies, but remarkable.
And there are a lot of more timid people in Trump's orbit who are very, very happy to see Marjorie Taylor Greene making that point publicly that they don't necessarily want to make privately. What these people are all aware of is that Laura Loomer has not just been a political problem for the president, but over the summer, she got him in legal trouble because he kept repeating statements that she was making, posting conspiratorial claims that she originated on his own social media feeds about the judge who was overseeing his Manhattan hush money trial. And he bumped up into that gag order over and over again, ratcheting up his own legal jeopardy, in part because he just loved the content that Laura Loomer was putting out and couldn't help himself from amplifying it.
Yeah, I think the kind of associations here are real, and I think Trump has to be asked these questions, right? It happened before the heat of the campaign, but a year and a half ago, he sat down with Nick Fuentes, with a white supremacist neo-Nazi, and has never really been pushed on how does that happen. And she's sort of an extension of that.
If Greene is right that Loomer doesn't represent Trump and Loomer doesn't represent MAGA, Trump can make that point.
Yes.
Trump can clarify
That's
that.
right.
Yes.
That's right. He could check our Truth Social accounts to see if that happens. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate it. Coming up, we want to turn now, or actually to the very latest on what is now Tropical Depression Francine as it continues to dump rain across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. The storm made landfall as a Category 2 hurricane yesterday on the Louisiana coast. Right now, 12 million people are under flood warnings and 400,000 are without power in the Gulf region. Forecasters say heavy rain is expected through tomorrow with the possibility of tornadoes. New Orleans saw more rain than expected, 5 to 7 inches in many places, leading to scenes like this. A Good Samaritan used a hammer to smash a window of a truck, rescuing the driver who was stuck inside. Officials say they rescued about 24 people in the quickly rising waters, which receded today. Meantime, dry conditions and intense heat are fueling several large wildfires out west. At least 65 fires are burning right now, with 3 major wildfires threatening homes. California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency in Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. Still to come, both campaigns vying for the Native American vote in all-important Arizona. Meet the Press Now continues next. Welcome back. Former President Trump is expected to speak in just a few minutes in Arizona. Just moments ago, speaking to Telemundo, President Trump reiterated that he doesn't think another debate is necessary. As we said, he's in Arizona, a state that could very well determine who wins the White House and which party controls the Senate. And that's casting a unique spotlight on the state's large Native American population. NBC News campaign embed Alex Tabbitt has more.
At the Navajo Nation Parade in Window Rock, Arizona, politicians out in full force to court the Native American vote. In 2020, their vote was pivotal. Arizonans on reservations cast a record-breaking 58,121 ballots last cycle. And President Biden picked up more than 70% of the votes in nearly every precinct on the Navajo and Hopi reservations. In 2024, the Trump campaign is looking to change that dynamic.
You're living out here, you have to haul water, and you usually have to travel something like 45 miles to get to where to get the water and then back.
Arguing many of the issues facing all Americans are exacerbated on the reservation.
So if you're looking at gas prices that are out of control, it's going to cripple you.
The Harris campaign also at the parade.
Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
Emphasizing the importance of women in tribal cultures.
Very important that we honor and we respect women.
And hoping it garners support for Vice President Harris.
People say women are not supposed to be leaders. We already have that in our culture, in our stories.
Senate candidates also present at the parade, with Congressman Ruben Gallego touting his experience passing legislation for Native communities.
Just last year, I passed the Native American Child Protection Act. I also introduced the Badges Act. Badges Act helps tribal communities actually hire tribal law enforcement.
And Carrie Lake hitting on immigration.
It is an insult to the good people in Navajo Nation
that people are pouring across our border illegally, and they're getting more help than the people on the Navajo Nation.
By far the most popular at the parade was former Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez.
One of the things that we bring to the table is the experience of dealing with the federal government.
A Democrat running to become Arizona's first indigenous congressman.
Well, it is about time.
Despite the heavy political presence, many Native voters telling NBC News that both political parties aren't doing enough to solve issues on the reservation.
They're not paying attention to it a lot.
It seems to me, it doesn't really matter to them.
Being that we're the Aboriginal landholders of all of the land, so I don't think they really pay attention to us.
Alex Tabbitt, Window Rock, Arizona.
Our thanks to Alex for that fantastic report. We will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News stations. I'll have an exclusive interview with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, plus Trump's running mate, Senator J.D. Vance. Don't miss it. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.